He stood at the top of the basement stairs, staring at the padlock. A heavy-duty padlock on the outside of a basement door in his own home. A lock he'd never seen before. His hands were shaking as he fumbled with the bolt cutters. When the lock finally gave way and the door swung open, what George Fenton saw in that basement would haunt him for the rest of his life. His wife Eleanor, lying in the corner on a filthy mattress, emaciated, dehydrated, barely conscious, surrounded by her own waste. And his daughter, the person he'd trusted to care for her mother, was nowhere to be found. I'm a criminal defense attorney in Chicago, Illinois, but this one I prosecuted. Because sometimes justice requires standing up for the victims, not just defending the accused. Let me tell you how a family's trust became a mother's nightmare. George Fenton was 69 years old when he walked into my office in early 2023. He was a retired engineer, a man who'd spent his career solving problems with logic and precision. But the problem sitting in front of him now couldn't be solved with engineering. His wife Eleanor, 68 years old, had been diagnosed with Lewy body dementia about 18 months earlier. If you're not familiar with LBD, it's a particularly cruel form of dementia, worse than Alzheimer's in many ways. LBD causes cognitive decline, yes, memory problems, confusion, difficulty with reasoning. But it also causes hallucinations, severe movement problems similar to Parkinson's disease, and extreme fluctuations in alertness and attention. One day, Eleanor might be relatively lucid and able to hold a conversation. The next day, she might not recognize her own husband or know where she was. The disease required constant supervision, 24/7 care. Eleanor couldn't be left alone for more than a few minutes. George had been Eleanor's primary caregiver since the diagnosis. He'd retired early from his engineering job to devote himself full-time to caring for his wife. He helped her dress, he prepared her meals, he managed her medications. He kept her safe when she became confused or agitated. It was exhausting work. George loved his wife deeply, but the physical and emotional toll of caregiving was overwhelming. He'd aged 10 years in the 18 months since Eleanor's diagnosis. But George was devoted. He would do anything for Eleanor. They'd been married for 43 years, high school sweethearts who'd built a life together. 2 kids, a comfortable home in a nice Chicago neighborhood, a good retirement saved up. George and Eleanor had one daughter, Brenda, 40 years old, unmarried, and struggling. Brenda had always been the problem child. She'd dropped out of college after 2 years. She'd bounced between jobs, never holding anything steady. She'd had a drug problem in her 20s, though she claimed to be clean now. She'd repeatedly asked her parents for money to pay rent, cover bills, fund various schemes that never panned out. George and Eleanor had helped Brenda financially for years, probably too much. They'd enabled her dependence. But she was their daughter. What were they supposed to do? Let her become homeless? Still, George had misgivings about Brenda. She'd never shown much responsibility. She'd never demonstrated maturity or reliability. She'd always put her own needs first. But she was family, and when George needed help, who else could he turn to? In October 2023, George received word that his brother Michael in California had died suddenly of a heart attack. Michael was only 65. It was unexpected and devastating. George needed to travel to California for the funeral and to help Michael's wife with arrangements. The trip would take at least 10 days, maybe 2 weeks. But he couldn't leave Eleanor alone. Her dementia was too advanced. She needed constant supervision. George considered hiring a professional caregiver to stay at the house while he was gone, but that was expensive. Thousands of dollars for 24-hour care for 2 weeks. Brenda offered an alternative. "Dad, let me stay with Mom while you're gone. I can take care of her. You don't need to pay some stranger. I'm her daughter." George was hesitant. "Brenda, this is serious responsibility. Your mother needs help with everything: bathing, eating, medications. She gets confused and tries to wander. She needs watching constantly. I know, Dad. I can handle it. I want to help. You've never done anything like this before. I know. But Mom needs family right now, not some hired nurse. Please, Dad, let me do this. Let me prove I can be responsible. George wanted to believe his daughter could step up. He wanted to believe she'd matured. And frankly, he didn't want to spend thousands on professional care if family could do it. Against his better judgment, George agreed. He spent 2 days training Brenda on Eleanor's care routine, how to help her to the bathroom, what foods she could eat safely, which medications she needed and when, how to respond when Eleanor became confused or agitated. Brenda seemed attentive during the training. She took notes. She asked questions. She seemed genuinely committed to helping. George felt slightly better about leaving. He also took financial precautions. He transferred $50,000 from his savings into a joint checking account that Brenda could access. This was for emergencies, for Eleanor's medications, for any supplies Brenda might need, and for Eleanor's medical expenses if she needed to go to the hospital. This money is for your mother's care, George emphasized. Medical expenses, food, supplies, emergency needs only. I understand, Dad. I won't touch it unless Mom needs something. I'm serious, Brenda. This is not money for you. This is for Eleanor's care. I know. Don't worry. George left for California on October 15th. His flight departed early in the morning. He kissed Eleanor goodbye, told her he'd be back soon, and left his daughter in charge. For the first 3 days, everything seemed fine. George called every evening from California. Brenda always answered cheerfully. How's your mother? She's good, Dad. We're doing fine. She ate a good dinner tonight. She's sleeping peacefully now. Any problems? Any confusion or agitation? Nothing I can't handle. We're managing. Focus on Uncle Michael's arrangements. We're okay here. George felt reassured. Maybe Brenda really could handle this. Maybe she was finally showing maturity and responsibility. But by day 4, George started noticing something odd. When he called, Brenda always answered very quickly, as if she'd been waiting by the phone. And she always cut the conversations short. Dad, I need to go. Mom needs something. Can I talk to her? She's sleeping right now. I don't want to wake her. Okay, well, tell her I called. Tell her I love her. I will. Bye, Dad. Click. Every conversation was like that. Brief. Brenda sounding slightly rushed, never letting George talk to Eleanor directly. George told himself he was being paranoid. Brenda was busy caring for Eleanor. Of course, she couldn't chat for long. Of course, Eleanor couldn't always come to the phone. But something felt wrong. By day 7, George's unease had grown into genuine worry. He tried calling at different times of day. Early morning, mid-afternoon, late evening. Every time, Brenda answered quickly and ended the call within a minute. Everything's fine, Dad. Mom's doing great. I need to go now. Bye. George considered cutting his trip short and coming home early. But Michael's funeral was in 2 days. George needed to be there. He couldn't abandon his sister-in-law at such a difficult time. He told himself he'd be home in 3 more days. 3 more days, and he could see for himself that Eleanor was okay. Those 3 days felt like an eternity. Finally, on October 25th, George flew back to Chicago. His flight landed at O'Hare in the afternoon. He took a cab home, exhausted from travel and grieving his brother, but eager to see Eleanor. When he arrived at the house, he immediately noticed something wrong. The house was too quiet, unnaturally quiet. Brenda? Eleanor? I'm home. No response. George walked through the house. The kitchen was messy. Dirty dishes piled in the sink, empty food containers on the counter. But no Brenda, no Eleanor. George checked the master bedroom. Empty. Eleanor's bed hadn't been slept in. The sheets were still made from when George had left 10 days ago. George's heart started pounding. Where was Eleanor? He checked every room on the main floor. Nothing. He went upstairs. Eleanor's old craft room, unused for months, was empty. The bathroom was empty. Then he saw it. A note on the kitchen table in Brenda's handwriting. Dad, I had to go out for a few hours. Mom is fine. Be back later. B. But where was Eleanor? George started to panic. He checked the garage. Eleanor's wheelchair was still there, so she couldn't have gone far. But where was she? Then George heard it. A faint sound. A weak moaning sound coming from below. The basement. George and Eleanor rarely used the basement. It was unfinished, cold, damp. Just a place to store old furniture and boxes of things they didn't use anymore. George went to the basement door. It was closed, and there was something attached to the outside of the door that George had never seen before. A heavy padlock. Industrial strength. The kind you'd use on a storage unit. Someone had installed a lock on the basement door from the outside, which meant someone inside the basement couldn't get out. George's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold his phone. He called 911 first. This is George Fenton at 2847 Maple Street. I think my wife is locked in the basement. Send an ambulance. Please hurry. Then George ran to the garage and grabbed the bolt cutters. He raced back to the basement door and cut through the padlock. The door swung open. George flipped on the light and rushed down the stairs. What he saw nearly broke him. Eleanor was in the corner of the basement, lying on a thin, stained mattress. She was curled in the fetal position, wearing a soiled nightgown. There was a plastic bucket next to her, overflowing with waste. The smell was overpowering. Eleanor! Oh God, Eleanor! George knelt beside his wife. Her eyes were half open, but unfocused. Her skin was pale and papery. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. She'd lost a shocking amount of weight. Her cheekbones protruded. Her wrists were thin as twigs. Eleanor, it's me. It's George. I'm here. You're safe now. Eleanor's eyes moved slightly toward George's voice, but she didn't seem to recognize him. She made a weak sound, something between a moan and a whimper. George noticed a tray on the floor near the mattress. There was half a sandwich on it, moldy. A cup of water, mostly empty. That was it. That was all the food and water in the basement. The basement had no windows, no ventilation. The temperature was probably in the low 50s, uncomfortably cold. There was no blanket on the mattress, just Eleanor in a thin nightgown. How long had she been down here? How long had his daughter kept his wife locked in this basement like an animal? The paramedics arrived within minutes. They rushed down to the basement, assessed Eleanor quickly, and immediately called for a stretcher. Sir, we need to get her to the hospital immediately. She's severely dehydrated, malnourished, hypothermic. We need to go now. They carried Eleanor up from the basement and loaded her into the ambulance. George climbed in beside her, holding her frail hand. At the hospital, doctors conducted emergency treatment. IV fluids for dehydration. Warming blankets for hypothermia. Full medical assessment. The doctor's report was devastating. Eleanor had lost 14 pounds in 10 days. She was severely dehydrated, to the point where her organs were at risk of failure. She had bed sores from lying on the thin mattress. She had a urinary tract infection. She was malnourished. But the physical damage wasn't even the worst part. The psychological trauma was profound. Eleanor's dementia had worsened dramatically from the stress and fear of being locked in that basement. She was now almost completely non-responsive. She didn't recognize George. She showed signs of severe trauma. The doctor pulled George aside. Mr. Fenton, I need to ask you something. Who was caring for your wife while you were gone? My daughter, Brenda. Your daughter did this? George couldn't speak. He just nodded. Mr. Fenton, this is elder abuse. Severe elder abuse. I'm required by law to report this to Adult Protective Services and to the police. I know. Please do. I want my daughter arrested. The doctor placed a hand on George's shoulder. I'm sorry this happened. Your wife, the trauma may have accelerated her dementia. She may never recover to where she was before. George broke down. 10 days. He'd been gone 10 days. And in that time, his daughter had nearly killed his wife. The police arrived at the hospital within an hour. George told them everything. They went to the house to investigate and collect evidence. What they found confirmed George's worst fears. The basement showed clear signs of prolonged confinement. The soiled mattress, the overflowing bucket, the minimal food and water, the padlock installed on the outside of the door. Security cameras from the neighbor's house captured footage of Brenda leaving the house multiple times during the 10 days George was gone, sometimes for hours at a time, carrying suitcases, loading things into her car. She'd been free to come and go, while her mother was locked in a basement. Police also discovered that the $50,000 George had left in the joint account was gone, completely withdrawn. Brenda had taken every penny. A search of Brenda's apartment revealed stolen items from George and Eleanor's house. Eleanor's jewelry, including her wedding ring and several valuable pieces. A coin collection George had inherited from his father. Cash from various places in the house. Brenda had systematically robbed her own parents, while her mother was locked in a basement. Police issued a warrant for Brenda's arrest. They tracked her to O'Hare International Airport, where she was attempting to board a flight to Mexico. She was arrested at the gate, trying to flee the country with her stolen money. That's when George called me, not as a defense attorney, but as a prosecutor. I'd recently moved from criminal defense to the state's attorney's office, working on elder abuse cases. George sat in my office and told me the whole story. By the end, we were both in tears. I want her prosecuted, George said. I want my daughter to pay for what she did to my wife. She will, I promised. I'll make sure she faces justice for this. The case against Brenda Fenton was one of the most clear-cut prosecutions I'd ever handled. The evidence was overwhelming. But that didn't make it any easier emotionally. This wasn't some stranger who'd abused an elderly victim. This was a daughter who'd betrayed her own mother in the most horrific way imaginable. I started by interviewing George in depth. I needed to understand the family dynamics, Brenda's history, and exactly what had happened during those 10 days. Tell me about Brenda, I said during our second meeting. What kind of person is she? George looked pained. I want to say she's a good person who made terrible choices, but I don't know if that's true anymore. Tell me about her childhood, her relationship with Eleanor. Brenda was always difficult, even as a child, defiant, selfish. She and Eleanor clashed constantly. Brenda resented any attention we gave to her younger brother. She wanted to be the center of everything. Where is her brother now? James lives in Seattle. He's a software engineer, married, 2 kids. He's done well for himself. Brenda always resented that too. She felt like James was the favorite because he was successful. Was he the favorite? George considered this. No. We loved both our kids equally, but we were proud of James because he worked hard and built a good life. Brenda never applied herself to anything. She always took the easy way, and she blamed us for her failures. How did Brenda react when Eleanor was diagnosed with dementia? She barely reacted at all. She visited maybe twice in the first year after the diagnosis. She seemed uncomfortable around Eleanor. She couldn't handle seeing her mother decline. But she volunteered to care for Eleanor while you were in California. Yes, and I was suspicious, but I wanted to believe she'd changed. I wanted to believe she could step up and be responsible. Did you ever suspect she might hurt Eleanor? Never. Never in my worst nightmares did I think she'd do something like this. Neglect her, maybe. Not take care of her properly. But to lock her in a basement? To leave her there for 10 days? I never imagined my daughter was capable of that. I moved on to building the evidentiary case. I needed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Brenda had committed aggravated abuse of an elderly person and theft. First, I collected all medical evidence. Hospital records showing Eleanor's condition when she arrived at the emergency room. Doctor's reports documenting severe dehydration, malnutrition, hypothermia, bed sores, infection. Photographs of Eleanor's emaciated body, which were heartbreaking but necessary. Second, I documented the crime scene. Police photos of the basement, the soiled mattress, the bucket, the moldy food, the padlock installed on the door, the cold, dark conditions. Everything painted a picture of deliberate confinement and neglect. Third, I obtained the security camera footage from the neighbor's house. The cameras faced the street and captured Brenda's comings and goings. The footage showed Brenda leaving the house on multiple occasions, sometimes for several hours. She was seen carrying suitcases and bags to her car. She was clearly not inside caring for Eleanor during these absences. Fourth, I subpoenaed bank records showing Brenda had withdrawn all $50,000 from the joint account. The withdrawals began on day 2 of George's trip. Large ATM withdrawals and transfers to Brenda's personal account. By day 8, the account was empty. Fifth, I cataloged all the stolen property recovered from Brenda's apartment. Eleanor's jewelry, appraised at over $30,000. George's coin collection, worth about $15,000. Cash totaling $8,000. Electronics, artwork, and other valuables. The theft charges would be easy to prove. The abuse charges were even more clear-cut. But I also needed to prove intent. I needed to show that Brenda's actions were deliberate, not just negligent, that she'd intentionally confined and starved her mother, not simply failed to provide adequate care. That's where the padlock became crucial evidence. Brenda hadn't installed a lock because she was worried Eleanor might wander out of the basement. Eleanor couldn't walk more than a few steps without assistance. She couldn't have navigated the basement stairs. Brenda installed the padlock to keep Eleanor contained, so Brenda could leave the house freely, without worrying about Eleanor calling for help or being discovered. It was premeditated confinement, premeditated abuse. I also interviewed Eleanor's doctors about her condition. One doctor, a neurologist named Dr. Sarah Chen, was particularly helpful. Eleanor's dementia has progressed dramatically since her hospitalization, Dr. Chen told me. The trauma of being confined in that basement, the stress, the fear, the physical deprivation, all of it has accelerated her cognitive decline. Is that normal with dementia patients? Severe stress can absolutely worsen dementia. The brain is already compromised. Additional trauma can push it past a tipping point. Eleanor may never recover to her previous functional level. Can you testify to that at trial? Absolutely. What happened to Eleanor is unconscionable. I want to help hold her daughter accountable. As I built the case, I also had to manage George's emotional state. He was devastated by what his daughter had done, but he was also struggling with guilt. I should never have left, George said during one of our meetings. I should have hired professional care. I knew Brenda wasn't reliable. George, you can't blame yourself. You couldn't have predicted she'd do something this monstrous. But I left Eleanor vulnerable. I put her at risk. Brenda put her at risk. Brenda made the choice to abuse her mother. That's not on you. George wanted justice for Eleanor, but he was also mourning the loss of his daughter, because even though Brenda was still alive, the daughter he thought he knew was gone, replaced by someone capable of unthinkable cruelty. Meanwhile, Brenda had hired a defense attorney, a man named Robert Carlson, who specialized in difficult cases. Carlson requested a meeting with me early in the case. I agreed, curious about what defense strategy he might present. We met at a coffee shop downtown. Carlson was in his 50s, experienced, professional. My client wants to take a plea, he said immediately. I was surprised. Really? You've seen the evidence? I've seen enough. This case is unwinnable. The evidence is overwhelming. My client made catastrophic choices. Then why are we meeting? To discuss terms. My client will plead guilty to all charges in exchange for sentencing consideration. What kind of consideration? She'll cooperate fully. She'll allocate in court, explaining what she did and why. She'll express remorse. In exchange, the state recommends a sentence at the lower end of the guidelines. I shook my head. No. Your client locked a helpless woman with dementia in a basement for 10 days. She starved her. She left her in her own waste. She stole from her. And then she tried to flee the country. There's no mitigating circumstances here. My client has mental health issues. She was under financial stress. She made terrible decisions, but she didn't intend to kill her mother. She nearly did kill her, and intent isn't necessary for the charges she's facing. Reckless disregard for human life is enough. So you won't negotiate. I'll take her guilty plea, but I'm recommending the maximum sentence, 15 years, and I'll fight any attempt to reduce it. Carlson sighed. I'll relay that to my client. You do that, and tell her that if she wants any chance at mercy, she better show genuine remorse. Because right now, all I see is someone who got caught. 3 weeks later, Carlson called me back. My client will plead guilty, no conditions. She'll face whatever sentence the judge imposes. Smart choice. The alternative was a trial where we'd present every horrific detail to a jury. I know. My client knows. We're not fighting this. The plea hearing was scheduled for January 2024. Brenda would enter her guilty plea, allocate on the record, and await sentencing. But before the plea hearing, I had one more thing to do. I needed to prepare George for what was coming, and I needed to decide whether to ask him to give a victim impact statement. George, Brenda is going to plead guilty. There won't be a trial. She'll admit to what she did. George looked relieved. Good. I don't want to go through a trial. At sentencing, the judge will allow victim impact statements. You can speak if you want to. You can tell the judge how this has affected you and Eleanor. Will Eleanor be there? We can arrange for her to be present if you think that's appropriate. But given her condition, no, I don't want her there. She doesn't understand what's happening. I won't put her through that. Then it would just be you speaking, if you choose to. George was quiet for a long time. What should I say? Whatever you want. How Brenda's actions have impacted your life. How they've affected Eleanor. What you think justice should look like. I don't know if I can face her. You don't have to decide now. Think about it. If you want to speak, I'll make sure you have the opportunity. George did think about it, and ultimately, he decided he needed to speak. Not for Brenda's sake, but for Eleanor's. Someone needed to advocate for Eleanor, who could no longer advocate for herself. The plea hearing arrived. The courtroom was small, a typical setting for plea proceedings. No jury, just the judge, attorneys, the defendant, and a few observers. Brenda was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit. She'd been held without bail since her arrest. She looked different than in the photos George had shown me. Thinner, older, defeated. Judge Maria Rodriguez presided. She'd been on the criminal bench for 20 years and had a reputation for being tough on elder abuse cases. Ms. Fenton, you're here to enter a plea of guilty to charges of aggravated abuse of an elderly person and theft. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor. Brenda's voice was barely audible. Has anyone threatened you or promised you anything in exchange for this plea? No, Your Honor. Do you understand that by pleading guilty, you're giving up your right to a trial? Yes, Your Honor. And you understand the maximum sentence you could face is 15 years in prison? Yes, Your Honor. Very well. I'll need you to allocute. That means explain in your own words what you did. Tell me about the crimes you're pleading guilty to. Brenda took a shaky breath. In October 2023, my father left me in charge of caring for my mother, who has dementia. Instead of caring for her, I locked her in the basement of their house. Why did you do that? Because I wanted to steal from them. I wanted to take money and valuables without my mother seeing what I was doing or being able to tell anyone. How long was your mother locked in the basement? 10 days. What conditions was she kept in? Brenda's voice broke. It was cold down there. Dark. I only gave her a little bit of food and water. She was on a dirty mattress. I didn't take care of her. Did you check on her during those 10 days? A few times, but not often. I was mostly out of the house. What were you doing while you were out? Stealing things from the house, withdrawing money from their bank account, planning to leave the country. Were you planning to return before your father came home? Brenda hesitated. I don't know. I wasn't thinking clearly. Miss Fenton, your mother nearly died. Do you understand that? Yes, Your Honor. I'm sorry. Who are you sorry to? My mother. My father. My family. Judge Rodriguez looked skeptical. We'll see about that at sentencing. I'm accepting your guilty plea. Sentencing is set for 6 weeks from today. Until then, you'll remain in custody. The hearing was over in 20 minutes. Brenda was led back out of the courtroom. She didn't look at George. She kept her eyes down the entire time. Outside the courtroom, George looked shaken. She didn't even look at me. Some people can't face what they've done. Do you think she's really sorry? I don't know, George. I honestly don't know. The 6 weeks between the plea and sentencing passed slowly for George. Eleanor remained in a specialized memory care facility, requiring round-the-clock professional care. Her condition had stabilized physically, but her dementia had progressed to the point where she rarely had lucid moments. George visited her every day. He'd sit beside her bed, hold her hand, and talk to her about their life together. Sometimes Eleanor seemed to recognize him. Most days, she didn't. The medical bills were crushing. Even with Medicare and supplemental insurance, the specialized care facility cost over $10,000 per month. George was depleting their retirement savings to pay for Eleanor's care. The $50,000 Brenda had stolen, that would have covered 5 months of Eleanor's care. Instead, it was gone. Spent by Brenda on, well, police had never fully traced where all the money went. Some of it was in cash when she was arrested. The rest had been spent on things that couldn't be recovered. George was also preparing his victim impact statement. He'd written and rewritten it dozens of times. How do you summarize the devastation of what happened? How do you explain the betrayal, the anguish, the permanent damage? I worked with George on his statement, helping him focus on the key points while allowing him to express his pain. I don't want to be vengeful, George told me, but I want the judge to understand what Brenda took from us. Not just money. Our peace. Our trust. Eleanor's remaining quality of life. The judge will understand. Just speak from your heart. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for a Friday morning in late February. Chicago was in the grip of a bitter cold snap, temperatures well below zero. Somehow, that seemed fitting for such a grim occasion. The courtroom was more crowded for sentencing than it had been for the plea. Several reporters were present. Elder abuse cases had been in the news lately, and this one was particularly shocking. George sat in the front row with James, his son who'd flown in from Seattle. James had wanted to support his father and to see his sister sentenced for what she'd done to their mother. "I still can't believe Brenda did this," James had told me earlier. "I knew she was selfish and irresponsible. But this? Locking Mom in a basement? It's beyond comprehension." Brenda was brought into the courtroom. She'd lost more weight in the weeks since the plea. She looked gaunt, her cheekbones sharp, her eyes hollow. Whether from guilt or simply stress, I couldn't tell. Her attorney, Robert Carlson, sat beside her. He'd filed a sentencing memorandum, arguing for leniency based on Brenda's lack of criminal history, her alleged mental health issues, and her guilty plea. I'd filed my own memorandum, arguing for the maximum sentence of 15 years. The crime was too serious, the victim too vulnerable, the defendant's actions too calculated to warrant any mercy. Judge Rodriguez entered, and the proceedings began. "We're here for sentencing of Brenda Fenton, who has pleaded guilty to aggravated abuse of an elderly person and theft. I've reviewed the pre-sentence investigation report, the sentencing memorandums from both parties, and the victim impact statements. Before I impose sentence, I'll hear from the victim's family." I stood up. "Your Honor, George Fenton, the victim's husband and the defendant's father, would like to address the court." "Proceed." George walked slowly to the podium. He was 70 years old but looked older. The stress of the past few months had aged him. He placed his written statement on the podium, but didn't look at it. He spoke from memory, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Your Honor, 43 years ago, I married Eleanor Davis. She was the love of my life, my best friend, my partner in everything. We built a life together. We raised 2 children. We saved for retirement. We looked forward to growing old together. When Eleanor was diagnosed with Lewy body dementia, it was devastating. But I was committed to caring for her, to making sure her remaining years were as comfortable and dignified as possible. That was my job as her husband, my privilege. In October, I had to travel to California for my brother's funeral. I needed someone to care for Eleanor while I was gone. Against my better judgment, I trusted my daughter, Brenda. I gave her responsibility for Eleanor's care. I gave her access to money for Eleanor's needs. I trusted her with the most precious person in my life. And she betrayed that trust in the most horrific way I can imagine. My daughter locked my wife in a basement for 10 days. She kept her in conditions that wouldn't be acceptable for an animal. Cold, dark, filthy, minimal food and water. No care, no dignity, no humanity. While Eleanor was suffering in that basement, Brenda was stealing from us. She took $50,000. She took Eleanor's jewelry, including her wedding ring. She took family heirlooms. And then she tried to flee the country. When I found Eleanor in that basement, I barely recognized her. She'd lost 14 pounds. She was dehydrated to the point of organ failure. She was hypothermic. She was lying in her own waste. But the physical damage wasn't the worst of it. The psychological trauma destroyed what was left of Eleanor's mind. Her dementia has progressed dramatically since that day. She's now almost completely non-responsive. She doesn't recognize me most days. She doesn't speak. She just exists. The doctors say the trauma of being locked in that basement accelerated her cognitive decline. She may never recover to where she was before. The person I've loved for 43 years is gone. Not because of her disease, but because of what our daughter did to her. I visit Eleanor every day in the memory care facility where she now lives. I sit beside her and hold her hand. Sometimes I think she knows I'm there. Most days, I don't think she does. I'll never get back the time we should have had together, the conversations, the moments of connection, the ability to tell her I love her and have her understand. Brenda took that from us. She took Eleanor's dignity. She took her remaining quality of life. She took years of peace we should have had. And for what? For money. For a few $1,000s in jewelry and cash. For $50,000 she had no right to. My daughter put a price on her mother's suffering, and apparently, That price was pretty low. I don't know if Brenda is capable of understanding what she's done. I don't know if she feels genuine remorse or just regret that she got caught. I hope it's the former, but I suspect it's the latter. What I do know is that she needs to be held accountable, not just for the theft, though that was significant, but for the abuse, for the cruelty, for treating her own mother like garbage to be locked away and ignored. I'm asking you, Your Honor, to impose the maximum sentence, 15 years. Brenda needs to understand that what she did was unforgivable, and society needs to understand that elder abuse, especially by family members, will not be tolerated. Thank you. George's voice broke at the end. He stood at the podium for a moment, collecting himself, then returned to his seat. James put an arm around his father's shoulders. There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Even some of the court staff were wiping tears. Judge Rodriguez took a moment before speaking. Thank you, Mr. Fenton. I know that was difficult. Does the defense wish to present anything? Carlson stood up. Your Honor, my client would like to address the court. Go ahead. Brenda stood up slowly. She walked to the podium, her hands shaking. She looked at the judge but couldn't seem to look at her father. Your Honor, I know nothing I say can make up for what I did. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. But I need to say I'm sorry. I'm sorry to my mother. She trusted me. She needed me. And I failed her in the worst way possible. I let her down. I hurt her. I nearly killed her. I'm sorry to my father. He gave me a chance to prove I could be responsible, and I betrayed him. I stole from him. I destroyed his trust. I'm sorry to my brother and to everyone who's been hurt by my actions. I don't have a good explanation for why I did what I did. I was stressed about money. I was resentful about my life not turning out the way I wanted. I saw an opportunity to take what I felt I was owed, but I wasn't owed anything. My parents gave me everything growing up. They supported me financially for years. They helped me again and again, and I repaid that by stealing from them and hurting my mother. I understand that I need to be punished. I accept that. I deserve whatever sentence you impose. All I can say is that I will spend the rest of my life trying to become someone worthy of forgiveness, even if I never receive it. Brenda sat down. Her apology sounded sincere, but I'd heard enough insincere apologies from defendants to be skeptical. Judge Rodriguez addressed Brenda directly. Ms. Fenton, I've presided over hundreds of criminal cases in my 20 years on the bench. I've seen drug dealers, gang members, violent criminals. But what you did to your mother is among the most disturbing crimes I've encountered. You didn't harm a stranger. You harmed your own mother. A woman who gave you life, raised you, loved you, supported you for 40 years. Your mother was completely vulnerable. She had dementia. She couldn't protect herself. She couldn't call for help. She relied on you entirely. And you locked her in a basement like an animal. Not because you panicked, not because you didn't know what to do, but because you wanted to steal from your parents without interference. You chose money over your mother's life. You kept her in conditions that would be criminal if inflicted on a dog. Cold, dark, filthy, hungry, thirsty, alone. For 10 days, your mother nearly died, and the psychological trauma has destroyed what remained of her mind. According to medical testimony, your actions accelerated her dementia to the point where she may never have another lucid moment. You stole years of life from your mother. You stole peace from your father. You stole memories and moments they should have had together. And then you tried to flee the country with your stolen money. I've read your attorney's memorandum arguing for a reduced sentence based on your lack of criminal history and mental health issues. I'm not persuaded. Your lack of criminal history just means you hadn't been caught before. Your mental health issues, while real, don't excuse what you did. Plenty of people struggle with stress and financial problems. They don't lock their disabled mothers in basements. You made calculated, deliberate, choices. You installed a padlock. You withdrew money systematically. You planned your escape. These weren't the actions of someone overwhelmed or confused. These were the actions of someone committing premeditated abuse and theft. The sentencing guidelines recommend 8 to 15 years. The prosecution has requested the maximum. The defense has requested the minimum. I'm sentencing you to 15 years in the Illinois Department of Corrections. This sentence reflects the severity of your crime, the vulnerability of your victim, and the need to deter others from similar conduct. You'll also be required to pay restitution to your father in the amount of $50,000 for the money you stole, plus $30,000 for the stolen property. You'll have no contact with your father or any information about your mother's condition unless your father initiates it. I hope you use your time in prison to become the person you claim you want to be. But right now, you're someone who chose greed over compassion, money over family, and cruelty over care. May God have mercy on you, because this court will not. Judge Rodriguez brought down her gavel. Brenda was immediately taken into custody by bailiffs. She glanced back at her father once. George looked away. Outside the courtroom, reporters surrounded us. I made a brief statement. Today, justice was served for Eleanor Fenton and her family. Elder abuse is a serious crime with devastating consequences. This sentence sends a message that exploiting vulnerable elderly people, especially by family members, will result in serious punishment. George declined to speak to the press. James made a short statement on behalf of the family, thanking the court and the prosecution. Later, at my office, George, James, and I sat together. 15 years, George said. She'll be 55 when she gets out. With good behavior, probably 12, I said. But yes, it's a long sentence. Is it enough? James asked. For what she did to Mom? No sentence is enough, I said honestly. No amount of prison time can undo the harm. But it's accountability, it's justice, and it's protection for society. George was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, I keep thinking about what I said in my victim impact statement, about the time Eleanor and I should have had together, the moments we'll never get back. I know. Brenda took that. She stole time. You can't put a price on that. You can't get it back. No, you can't. So 15 years doesn't seem like enough. But infinity wouldn't seem like enough either. We sat in silence for a while. Then George stood up. I need to go visit Eleanor. I try to go every evening. She won't know I'm there. But I'll know. That's beautiful, George. It's all I have left. 3 years have passed since Brenda Fenton was sentenced. In that time, Eleanor's condition has continued to decline. She's now in the late stages of dementia, mostly bedridden, requiring total care. George still visits her every single day. He sits beside her bed, holds her hand, and talks to her about their life together. Sometimes he brings photo albums and shows her pictures of their wedding, their kids, their travels. Eleanor doesn't respond, but George keeps doing it anyway. I don't know if she hears me, George told me during one of our occasional check-ins. But I can't stop visiting. She's my wife. I made a vow. For better or worse, in sickness and in health. This is the in sickness part. You're a good man, George. I'm just doing what I committed to do 46 years ago. George has become an advocate for elder abuse awareness. He speaks at community centers and senior organizations about what happened to Eleanor. He warns elderly people and their families about the warning signs of abuse. People think elder abuse is always some stranger, George tells audiences. A crooked caregiver, a scam artist. They don't realize that the most common perpetrators are family members. Adult children who feel entitled to their parents' money. Relatives who see elderly family members as burdens or obstacles. George shares statistics. 1 in 10 Americans over age 60 experiences some form of elder abuse. Financial exploitation is one of the most common forms. And family members are the perpetrators in about 60% of cases. If you're elderly and you have money, you're a target, George warns. Even for your own kids. Especially if those kids are struggling financially or have a history of irresponsibility. George's talks are powerful because he speaks from experience. He's not a professional or an expert. He's a husband who trusted the wrong person with his wife's care and paid a terrible price. I've attended some of George's presentations. The response is always emotional. Other elderly people share their own stories of being exploited by family members. Adult children express fear about trusting relatives with their aging parents. One woman approached George after a presentation and told him, "My son has been pressuring me to give him power of attorney. After hearing your story, I realize he doesn't want to help me. He wants access to my assets. Thank you for opening my eyes." George and I also worked together to push for stronger elder abuse laws in Illinois. We testified before the state legislature about the need for enhanced penalties, better reporting mechanisms, and more resources for adult protective services. Some of the reforms we advocated for have been enacted. Mandatory minimum sentences for aggravated elder abuse. Requirements for background checks on anyone given power of attorney over an elderly person. Increased funding for investigating and prosecuting elder abuse cases. I can't change what happened to Eleanor, George says, but maybe I can prevent it from happening to someone else's wife or mother or father. Meanwhile, Brenda is serving her sentence at Logan Correctional Center, a women's prison about 3 hours from Chicago. She'll be eligible for parole in about 9 more years, having served 12 of her 15-year sentence. George has had no contact with Brenda since the sentencing. She's written him letters, which he's returned unopened. He doesn't want to hear from her. He doesn't want apologies or explanations. The damage is too great, the betrayal too deep. I lost my daughter the day I found Eleanor in that basement, George says. The person I thought was my daughter couldn't have done what Brenda did. So either I never really knew her, or the person she was is gone. Either way, I'm mourning her like she died. James, George's son, has tried to maintain some minimal contact with Brenda. He visits her in prison once a year. He says it's because she's still his sister, even though he's disgusted by what she did. I don't forgive her, James told me, but completely cutting her off feels wrong too. She's family. Terrible, criminal, unforgivable family, but still family. George doesn't judge James for maintaining contact. Everyone has to handle this their own way. James has a different relationship with Brenda than I do. She didn't betray him the same way. I've stayed in touch with George over the years, not as his attorney anymore, but as something like a friend. We meet for coffee every few months. He tells me about Eleanor's condition, about his advocacy work, about how he's coping. Some days are harder than others, George admits. The anger comes and goes. I'll be visiting Eleanor, and I'll suddenly remember her as she was. Vibrant, funny, sharp. And I'll get furious all over again that Brenda took that away. That's normal. I know. But I don't want to live in anger. Eleanor wouldn't want that. So I try to focus on the good memories. The 40 years we had before the dementia. the life we built together. About a year ago, George made a decision that surprised me. He decided to write a book about his experience, not for money or attention, but to create a comprehensive resource for families dealing with elder abuse. I want to tell our story in detail, George explained. Not just what happened, but the warning signs I missed, the mistakes I made, the red flags I ignored. If other people can learn from my experience, maybe some good can come from this tragedy. I helped George find a publisher. The book, titled The Locked Door, A Family's Story of Trust, Betrayal, and Elder Abuse, was published 6 months ago. The response has been overwhelming. The book has sold over 50,000 copies. George has been interviewed on podcasts, news programs, and talk shows. He's become a national spokesperson for elder abuse awareness. The book is difficult to read. George doesn't spare any details about finding Eleanor in the basement, about her condition, about the long-term damage. But it's also hopeful. It provides practical advice for protecting elderly loved ones. It explains warning signs of potential abuse. It offers resources for families dealing with similar situations. Reviews have been positive, with many readers sharing that the book helped them recognize abuse in their own families, or empowered them to protect vulnerable relatives. One reviewer wrote, "This book should be required reading for everyone with aging parents." George Fenton's story is heartbreaking, but his advice could save lives. The book has also generated discussion about a topic many people find uncomfortable: the reality that family members can be predators. That blood relation doesn't guarantee trustworthiness. That elderly people need to protect themselves even from their own children. People don't want to believe their kids would hurt them, George says in interviews. I didn't want to believe it either. But the statistics don't lie. Family members are the most common perpetrators of elder abuse. We need to acknowledge that reality. George uses proceeds from the book to fund an organization he founded, the Eleanor Fenton Foundation for Elder Protection. The foundation provides legal assistance to elderly abuse victims who can't afford attorneys. It funds adult protective services investigations. It offers support groups for families dealing with elder abuse. Eleanor can't speak for herself anymore, George says, so I speak for her, and for all the other elderly people who are vulnerable and voiceless. The foundation has helped dozens of elder abuse victims over the past year. Some cases involve physical abuse. Others involve financial exploitation. All of them involve people who trusted family members and were betrayed. One case that stands out involved an elderly man whose son had taken power of attorney and was draining his bank accounts. The foundation funded legal representation that got the power of attorney revoked and the money returned. The son was prosecuted and convicted. That's one more family like mine, George said when he told me about the case. One more elderly person saved from abuse. That's why I do this work. As for Eleanor, she continues to decline. Her doctors say she probably has less than a year left. The dementia has progressed to its final stage. She's no longer conscious most of the time. Her body is shutting down. George has made peace with her impending death. In some ways, it will be a relief, he admits. Not because I want to lose her, but because she won't be suffering anymore. This isn't any kind of life. He's already made arrangements for Eleanor's funeral. He's written her obituary. He's selected her burial plot next to the space where he'll eventually be buried. We'll be together again, George says. Maybe that's naive or wishful thinking, but it comforts me. I asked George recently if he'd ever forgive Brenda. He was quiet for a long time before answering. I don't know. Part of me wants to. Part of me thinks I should. Forgiveness is supposed to be healing, right? Sometimes. But I don't know if I can. What she did wasn't just a mistake or a momentary lapse in judgment. It was sustained cruelty. It was calculated abuse. It was choosing money over her mother's life. You don't have to forgive her. I know. But I also don't want to spend the rest of my life consumed by hatred. That's not healthy either. Maybe there's a middle ground. Acceptance without forgiveness. Acknowledgement of what happened without reconciliation. Maybe. I'm still figuring it out. As I reflect on this case years later, several lessons stand out. First, elder abuse by family members is far more common than most people realize. Adult children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, anyone with access to an elderly person can be a perpetrator. And financial stress, drug addiction, mental health issues, or simple greed can motivate terrible actions. Second, trust is not the same as verification. George trusted his daughter because she was his daughter, but he should have verified that trust with monitoring, check-ins, and oversight. Love doesn't require blind trust, especially when vulnerable people are involved. Third, warning signs matter. Brenda had a history of irresponsibility, financial problems, and self-centered behavior. Those were red flags that George recognized but chose to ignore. In situations involving vulnerable elderly people, red flags should be taken seriously. Fourth, accountability matters. Brenda could have received a lighter sentence if the judge had shown mercy, but mercy would have sent the wrong message. Elder abuse is serious. It deserves serious punishment. Accountability isn't just about justice for the victim. It's about deterring future abuse. And finally, surviving trauma doesn't mean moving on from it. George will carry the weight of what happened to Eleanor for the rest of his life. But he's chosen to transform that weight into purpose. His advocacy work, his book, his foundation, all of it gives meaning to his suffering. I still practice law in Chicago. I still prosecute elder abuse cases. And I always share George and Eleanor's story with new attorneys working in this field. Because prosecutors need to understand. These aren't just crimes we're prosecuting. These are families we're protecting. These are vulnerable people who trusted the wrong person and paid a terrible price. Every case matters. Every prosecution sends a message. Every conviction protects someone else's mother or father or grandparent from similar abuse. To anyone reading this who has elderly parents or relatives, protect them. Don't assume family members are trustworthy just because they're family. Monitor caregiving arrangements. Check in regularly. Look for warning signs. And if you suspect abuse, report it immediately. Don't wait. Don't make excuses. Don't assume the best. Eleanor Fenton waited, locked in a basement, hoping someone would save her. By the time George found her, the damage was irreversible. Don't let that happen to someone you love. 5 years after Eleanor was locked in that basement, I'm often asked how I've survived this ordeal. Here's my answer. I survive by remembering who Eleanor was before the abuse, before the dementia. I remember her laugh, her intelligence, her kindness. I remember 40 years of love and partnership. Brenda tried to reduce Eleanor to a victim, to someone weak and helpless. But Eleanor was so much more than that. She was a wife, a mother, a friend, a person who lived a full and meaningful life. Yes, she suffered at the end. Yes, my daughter's cruelty destroyed her remaining years. But that's not all Eleanor was. That's not her whole story. I also survived by trying to prevent what happened to Eleanor from happening to others. The foundation, the book, the speaking engagements, all of it gives purpose to the pain. If you're caring for an elderly loved one, be careful who you trust. Verify that caregivers are doing their jobs. Don't ignore warning signs, and remember that family members can be predators. If you're elderly and vulnerable, protect yourself. Don't give anyone complete control over your life or finances. Maintain connections with multiple people, not just one caregiver. Trust your instincts if something feels wrong. And if you suspect elder abuse, report it. Call Adult Protective Services. Call the police. Don't wait. Don't assume someone else will handle it. You might be the only one who can save someone. Eleanor couldn't save herself. I couldn't save her in time. But maybe by sharing her story, we can save someone else. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. And thank you for being vigilant in protecting the elderly people in your life. Do it for Eleanor. Do it for all the victims who couldn't speak for themselves. George Fenton. If this story affected you, please subscribe for more real legal cases about protecting vulnerable people and seeking justice. Share this with anyone caring for elderly relatives. Remember, family doesn't excuse abuse. Trust must be verified, and the vulnerable deserve our protection, even from their own family members. Stay vigilant.